Hi, good evening, everyone. Um, let's begin. My name is Dominique Petit-Frère, and as mentioned, I am the co-founder of Limbo Accra alongside my partner, Emil Grip. Our practice is rooted in the transformation of uncompleted building projects into new opportunities for urban development, community engagement, and sustainability. To begin my presentation, I'd like to reference The Divine Comedy by Dante Alighieri, a text that has profoundly shaped much of our collective understanding of the human condition. For those unfamiliar, Dante's Inferno famously begins in a space called limbo, a realm neither in hell or heaven, a place of suspension and waiting, of unresolved possibilities. It's a space not of punishment, but of pause, of lingering, and in between where things are left unfinished, unexplained, and unresolved. I have these images here because I've always been interested in understanding different artistic interpretations of what this realm of limbo exists as. And in the images before and in here, these are examples from different well-renowned artists of our time and of centuries ago that have been able to depict in their interpretation what this realm entails. And what I find very interesting, especially the image to the left of the poets in limbo, is that you find characters such as Homer, Socrates, and all these philosophical giants that occupy this space. So for us, we're very interested in understanding the spatiality of this realm of limbo. In many ways, this notion of limbo perfectly encapsulates how I've come to understand cities and architecture, particularly in Africa. Cities are constantly in states of becoming, never fully complete, always in flux. There are unfinished buildings, landscapes being reshaped, and people constantly reconfiguring their environments to fit new needs, new hopes, and new realities. In this sense, limbo isn't just an abstract idea from literature, it's a very real, tangible condition in which many of us live. This idea of limbo is the foundation of my practice, an architectural and philosophical inquiry into how we can reimagine these unresolved spaces as sites of potential rather than stagnation. Tonight, I want to share with you how this inquiry started, how it evolved, and where it's led me thinking about cities, material flows, and the relationship between the built and natural worlds. I want to invite you into that reflection tonight, to see cities not as static, but as dynamic, living ecosystems. Over the next 20 minutes, 15, 20 minutes, I will share a series of personal photographs. That's me doing my daily documentation of these sites. And research documentation that will dive into the journey of how I started my practice, limbo, and the evolution of this idea from something philosophical and literally to something profoundly architectural. To understand how I arrived at this intersection, let me take you back to where my journey began, unexpectedly here in Scandinavia. I grew up as a first-generation New Yorker with parents from both Ghana and Haiti, navigating between different cultural worlds. And yet, it was during my time as a master's student at Lund University in Sweden, studying international development, that I began to seriously consider architecture as a means of addressing global challenges. Oh, sorry. In Sweden, I was exposed to progressive urban planning and sustainability practices. Scandinavian countries, particularly Sweden, have long been leaders in developing urban spaces that balance environmental concerns with social equity. But it wasn't just the what of development that fascinated me, it was the how. How do these principles of sustainability apply to cities that are growing, shifting, and dealing with rapid, often uneven development? While my initial focus was international development, it was at Lund that I started to feel the pull of architecture. I began to see architecture not simply as a profession of building, but as a field deeply entwined with the socio-political and ecological realities of our time. This is where I began thinking more critically about cities and as sites of ongoing negotiation. Spaces where buildings, materials, and people are constantly interacting and adapting. I started asking myself, what happens when development doesn't go planned? when buildings remain unfinished or cities are left in a state of partial completion? These are questions that stayed with me, but at the time I didn't yet have the language or framework to fully explore them. As my studies progressed, my focus on international development naturally led me to architecture. What drew me was the realization that architecture, far from being just about creating new structures, was actually a means of addressing broader social, political, and environmental issues. I started to see architecture as a process, a tool for navigating the messy, complex realities of our urban growth, sustainability, and equity. At this point, my pivot from development studies to architecture was both gradual and inevitable. Development and architecture are deeply intertwined. They are both about shaping futures, whether through policy, infrastructure, or the built environment. But rather than focusing on constructing new buildings, I became increasingly interested in how we could repurpose, adapt, and reuse what was already there, especially in contexts where development has been interrupted or abandoned. My background as a first-generation New Yorker with roots in Ghana and Haiti also played a significant role in this. Growing up, I witnessed the rapid urbanization of New York with the towering skyscrapers and finished construction projects, alongside the unfinished and abandoned structures in parts of Accra that I would often travel to as a kid visiting family. This dual experience gave me a unique lens through which to view urban spaces, both their potential and their challenges. In 2018, my research at Lund brought me back to West Africa, where I began to take critical note of a striking phenomenon: uncompleted buildings. These were structures that had been started but never finished, often due to economic downturns, political instability, lack of resources, and so forth. Initially, these buildings seemed like failures, symbols of interrupted progress. But the more I look at them, the more I saw them differently. What if these unfinished structures weren't just failures? What if instead of being viewed as abandoned, they were seen as sites of possibility, spaces where new ideas could take root, where new forms of architecture, community, and life could emerge? This realization marked a turning point in my career. I began to think about how architecture could engage with these liminal spaces, not as something to demolish or ignore, but as something to be transformed. This, in essence, became the foundation for Limbo Accra, a practice rooted in the reimagining of unfinished spaces as sites of potential. So what does limbo look like in practice? In my work, I conceptualize cities as socio-natural formations, spaces where the social, the natural, and the political intersect. Cities are not just collections of buildings. They are shaped by the land beneath them, by the materials that flow through them, and by the people who inhabit them. So I have this image here, and this is a common display of materials throughout West African cities, and it's a common indicator for when someone is getting ready to build, right? You have the extracted sand, you have the rock chippings, and so forth to create the concrete blocks on site to which you saw in the previous images. So take sand for an example. Sand is one of the most widely used materials in construction, and yet it also is a finite resource. In places in cities like Accra in Ghana, Dakar in Senegal, Abidjan in Ivory Coast, Lomé in Togo, to which these photos were taken, and many other cities across the African continent, the extraction of sand for building has caused significant environmental degradation, leading to erosion of beaches and displacement of communities. In this sense, cities are shaped by sedimentary politics, the movement of extraction of natural materials that in turn shape urban life. By thinking of cities in this terms of the material flows that we witness, how they interact with geological forces like sand, water, and sediment, we can start to see them not just as human creations, but as geosocial formations. This is where the concept of limbo really comes to life. It's not just about the built environment, it's about how cities are formed, transformed, and shaped by both human and natural forces. So in my research, I delved into this idea of sociogeological politics, exploring how cities, particularly in Africa, are shaped by the flow of materials, people, and capital By thinking of cities as geosocial formations, we can begin to understand how urban development is not just a human endeavor, but a geological one as well. This opens up new ways of thinking about architecture, ways that are deeply connected to environmental sustainability, social justice, and the larger forces shaping our world. With these ideas in mind, limbo came to be as a spatial and philosophical practice dedicated to engaging with these unfinished buildings, with the materials that surround them, and exploring new ways to think about urbanism through through a trans-species lens, engaging with both human and non-human forces. Our first activation took place in Adringano, Ghana, where we reimagined an unfinished structure as a space for regenerative community engagement and artistic practice, transforming the site into a new model for making new forms of public space. Following this, just going to continue to go through some more photos of just illustrating how development takes place in contemporary West Africa today, and how a lot of our buildings are positioned and exist as. Cool. So following this, we were invited to present our work internationally and in site-specific contexts such as the Sharjah Architecture Triennale, where we began to expand our thinking about how unfinished structures could serve as new sites for new possibilities, not just in Africa, but globally. One thing we've realized is that this is not just an African phenomenon or an African challenge. This is a planetary issue. We have ruins that are littered across our entire planet. And so this is an issue that we see as something that has potential to be addressed collectively as opposed to an isolated condition. So being in Sharjah really allowed for that introspection. So we began to expand our thinking about how unfinished buildings and unfinished structures could serve as sites for new possibilities, not just in Africa, but globally. Limbo isn't just about architecture. It's about rethinking how we engage with the built environment, especially in the face of rapid urbanization and climate change. These are some images of us in the space last year, doing some examination of the interior skeleton of the site. And since we're not able to showcase our projects, I'll leave it at that. And these are other buildings that also exist in the UAE exist within this liminal state. And for us, it was quite interesting, because the UAE has a lot of resources where they can build, unbuild, and build again. So it was interesting to find these pocket of voids and seeing that regardless of the amount of resources one nation has, this phenomenon exists regardless. So at Limbo, we began to document these buildings through a digital archive, using technologies like photogrammetry to scan these structures and create a repository of data and understand the building stock that exists in this state from Africa and other parts of the world. This is an interesting project, actually. As you can see, this is a highway that was built in the 70s in Cape Town, South Africa. And it's been left unfinished in this state, protruding right in the city. And the reason for its failure is due to the fact that there was a engineering mishap where the two opposing sides of the highways didn't end up meeting. So it exists in this state. And so with regards to our practice, we don't just identify unfinished buildings, but we also identified unfinished infrastructural projects that also end up in this state. So in order to build this archive, it's been fascinating to establish and create a repository that allows us to analyze these structures in new ways. The archive is not just about preservation, it's about creating a platform for dialogue, for understanding the interconnected value of these sites. So what we do is search through Reddit, Twitter platforms, YouTube, and different digital media sites where we can engage with local individuals that exist in proximity to these sites and actually hear from the people themselves in this new format of what they imagine these sites to look at and what their perspectives and what their stories are of how these sites are rendered within this incomplete state. And what we find interesting is that there's a lot of information online about building projects that are unfinished, how much they cost, when they were built, the size, and so forth. And so all of this information is what we're collecting to really build a comprehensive data archive of these sites to understand the amount of building stock that exists in this state. Through digital platforms, as I mentioned, like Reddit and Twitter, we've been engaging with local communities who live near these unfinished buildings. Their insights are crucial to our work because they offer perspectives that are often overlooked by traditional architects and planners. It's important to note that, again, as I mentioned earlier, uncompleted buildings are not unique to Africa. Across the planet, in places like China, as illustrated here, Turkey, Italy, and Cuba, unfinished structures exist as a global phenomenon. They often result from economic crashes, political upheavals, or environmental disasters. No matter where they are located, these structures represent an opportunity to rethink how we build and rebuild our cities. So the possibilities for reuse are endless. Unfinished buildings can be transformed into community centers, schools, housing, or even green public spaces that can restore the ecological imbalance that we face today. By recognizing their interconnected value, we can create sustainable solutions that benefit both the environment and the people who inhabit these spaces. Centralizing data on these sites allow us to make connections that would otherwise be lost. Why is this important? These unfinished structures are not isolated. They're part of a larger global narrative of urban development, migration, material flows, and socio-political forces. By building this digital repository, we can create a living archive that informs future projects, serving as a resource for architects, planners, researchers, municipals, even developers, and local communities. This centralized body of knowledge helps us identify patterns, failures, yes, but also potential. By analyzing unfinished buildings across different regions, from Africa to the Middle East, Asia, and Europe, we see common threads and opportunities for adaptive reuse and transformation. With the right data, these sites become opportunities waiting to be unlocked, guiding new architectural practices that prioritize sustainability, community engagement, and resilience in the face of climate change. By connecting data globally, we foster a planetary dialogue about urbanization. These buildings are part of a global urban crisis, one that holds immense potential. This repository helps us find common ground in approaching urban development amid environmental and socioeconomic challenges. In conclusion, I want to leave you with this idea. Architecture is not just about space, it's about the flows of materials, the movement of people, and the transformation of cities. In a world where urbanization is accelerating at an unprecedented rate, we must rethink how we engage with the unfinished, the incomplete, and the suspended. Limbo is more than just a state of waiting, it's a state of becoming. Limbo is about claiming the possibilities of making these unfinished spaces as part of the urban fabric, locally dealt with, repurposed, and reimagined. This practice is about promoting environmental justice and creating a new way of thinking about architecture, one that is rooted in the material realities of the city and the space that it's in. Thank you.
Thank you, Dominique, for showing us a very different perspective. It was not projects, but kind of the archive is a project. It's a very important project. Maybe to be a little bit to your story, how come that you came to Lund? You picked Lund. You were based in New York.
Yes. So my partner is Danish, and we were living in Copenhagen at the time, and I was young, and I wanted to continue my studies. So
what what learnings were you able to take from the time at the university in Lund that you were able to put in place for your work later?
I think what was interesting about I guess, taking an academic study in Lund in Sweden, especially coming from America as a New Yorker, was seeing the different perspectives and how, this country approached development. And I think for me, that tension really allowed me to pivot and see that, the traditional canon for approaching development in Africa was quite outdated. And I wanted to find new ways of actually implementing change. And in order to do so, I felt architecture was the tool to build and create and really see tangible effects or impact within the society.
And were you born, because I don't know it, were you born in the US, in New York?
Yes, I was born in New York as a first generation.
And when did you go into Haiti or Ghana and saw the other world? How old were you?
Well, I was born in New York in 1993, and as early as 6 years old, my family has taken me back and forth between Ghana and New York. So I've always been exposed and witnessed the development of Accra, of our country, and seeing its progress towards development. So doing a master's degree in Sweden and seeing what was being taught in terms of development and seeing what was actually being done in these countries, I felt that there was a gap and that there was a need to create a new model to address our global challenges.
I can imagine as a kid, I had definitely other thoughts, but if you as a kid see two different worlds, must be...
You create your own.
You kind of, it's normal for you, but not for others, I guess. I mean, you know it because you have done it always, but must be so very different upbringing to your friends in New York.
Well, I mean, this is the story of everyone in New York. New York City is a city of immigrants. So a lot of my friends are also all first generations where you have your parents or families who have migrated to America for better socioeconomic opportunities. So you grow up with friends that travel to Vietnam and go to Pakistan and go to, all these different places around the world. So for us, it's very much of a natural thinking process, a natural mind state or a natural perspective, let's say. And I think with that experience, I'm allowed to think differently in terms of how do I approach my built environment? How do I approach my surroundings? And how do I engage with them in intuitive and intentional ways?
What has been your most fulfilling moment so far? Was that maybe the build skate park that seen people using it? Or I don't know, maybe there's another one.
I think for me, what's been fulfilling is that, it's a constant process. I don't feel like there's an end destination to this practice. And for me, what I really appreciate about this is that I continue to raise awareness that, this spatial phenomenon exists and that it exists at this scale, not just in Africa, but, across the planet, and really trying to find more modern and contemporary ways of, arriving at solutions towards this issue, because we as a studio, we don't like to be the sole prescribers of what these spaces can exist as. We like to work with experts across regions, both local and internationally, to be able to resolve these sites.
In the context of your following quote, you said, charging older buildings with new intentions give me a sense of meaning and a sense of power. You also said you don't necessarily need to be an architect to build.
Right.
Which some people might argue with that. Can you elaborate what you mean by that?
I mean, in a sense, when I look at the architectural practice and from my experience, there's always a team that you work with, right? So, of course, you're going to always have a licensed individual to sign off on the documents or, whatever the case is. But at the end of the day, anyone can contribute an idea or a thought or a feeling of how they would like this space or any space to exist as. And I think not providing that opportunity to the general public and isolating it only in a professional title, is something that I try to work against in terms of really empowering those that live in proximity to these spaces to reimagine what they can look like. And then, of course, working with experts to really resolve it, right? But at the end of the day, anyone has the brain and the mind and the imagination to redesign or re-articulate what these spaces can look at.
At the same time, I was always also thinking maybe it's because in Accra people just do it. Don't wait for an architect to bring the plans for building something, and just they go for it and do it. Maybe I'm wrong, but
I mean, it's a mix, right? Like, of course, you have your contractors and architects you work with, but in most cases, yeah, people either work with natural materials such as the earth to sculpt and build, right, their homes and dwellings, or as I showed in my presentation, people extract certain materials to create the blocks themselves on site to start laying and building.
When, like, in many places, not only about Ghana, but where in, say, global south or developing countries, where challenges can differ greatly from those in Sweden, for example, how do you approach sustainability in a context where immediate survival needs often take priority over long-term planning? How do you, I mean, when the immediate survival needs are way higher than sustainability, than being sustainable, how do you approach sustainability? Because I mean, it's not even an issue. The issue is to survive and to live, not just like what's going to happen in 50 or 60 years.
Yeah, I think that's quite interesting because obviously we see the effect of that immediacy or that urgency and mind state has rendered these sites to be incomplete, right? Because people are building with not enough funds to complete the project. They're building in spaces where they shouldn't. So I think it's a matter of finding a balance. And I think with the idea behind building this archive is to, again, bring awareness to the amount of building stock that exists on the continent in this scale and in this format, and to, present this data, to municipal government leaders, developers, whoever has the funds and the authority to actually do something about it, right? Because there's real needs on the continent, as you're mentioning, right? There's needs to build hospitals, schools, parks, and so forth. And these sites can be transformed into that, as opposed to trying to find land, building a project ground up, and then you face the same challenges we already see, right? So how can we already work with the sites that are there, negotiate with the owners, and find a way to transform them into addressing these critical needs?
I was thinking of more of a, I don't know, I was lately in Indonesia, and people who need to build a house won't go for something that is more sustainable because need to work harder or pay more money for building it. They will not think of being sustainable. The first thing will be to work. So what's the next day? So what's most of a general thinking of how should we approach, or so people, how should people approach sustainability when survival is the first priority and not planning ahead?
I mean, I think even the definition of sustainability is a tricky one, right? Because, of course, people often equate sustainability to green practices, right? But in my thinking, I think of sustainability as more of a generational context, right? Like, how can we ensure that what we're even putting up, even if it can't be completed, right? We can think of new ways and new ideas of reprogramming it so that we can return some, create it as a form of public good in some way. Because oftentimes, I'll share a quick example. Oftentimes when people build in Ghana, the first thing they say is, have you cleared the land? Meaning, have you stripped the property of any form of vegetation and life form? And that is affecting our society, right? We're having serious flooding issues, we're having serious issues with just overall air quality and so forth. And so if we already see our cities littered with these concrete voids, how can then we restore these spaces to meet some of these sustainable goals and provide more of a holistic environment?
If we can make it, we have two more questions. One is, for you, it's a priority to engage African architects in your practice, right?
And I mean, as I mentioned, this is a planetary issue, right? So I'm much more interested in engaging with, both local and international players in terms of how do we address, this situation.
Because I wanted to ask when did you decide this, and what was the reason? So there was something that you said in an interview that it's a priority for you to engage in your practice, African female
yes,
architects.
Yeah.
And I wonder, when did you decide that, and what was the reason?
I guess just as a pure point of reflection, looking at myself, right, as someone that has entered this industry in a non-traditional format. I feel like that, my process within all of this is an opportunity to empower other women or other individuals in these contexts that may not have the tools to become an architect or a designer or whatever the case is. And so I think, when I mentioned quotes like that, and when I and speak in such breadth, it's really just to empower the next generations that come after us and see what they can do beyond the traditional confines of what an architect is supposed to be.
Yeah.
The future is bright.
I fully support that idea. I wanted to hear your reason behind. And you mentioned also in one of the interviews I was researching, your mother and your father as one of your two heroes. What values and learnings do you take for your work?
Similar to what Andrea said, do it. Just do it. Do what you feel called to, It's a spirit of an immigrant. It's a spirit of a New Yorker. It's a spirit of any, person that has the will to do. So yeah.
Thank you, Dominique, for being here. We have enjoyed your talk, and thank you very much. We'll have later a round of discussion together.
Fantastic. Thank you.